At the height of America's Gilded Age, when industrial fortunes created family dynasties to rival European nobility, a strange fate seemed to follow the wives and daughters in these newfound kingdoms of wealth. Raised in marble halls and educated in finishing schools, these American princesses would inherit more than just vast fortunes. They would inherit the weight of dynasty, the pressure of preservation, and often the curse of too much too soon. Their tales weave through the grandest addresses of Newport and New York, through European castles and Manhattan penthouses, revealing the dark side of American royalty, where golden cradles often rocked with tears, and where inheritance could be both a blessing and a burden. Today we share how their stories paint a fascinating portrait of wealth's double edge, in a place where privilege and peril danced an elaborate waltz in America's grandest ballrooms. In 1911, a mining heiress with more courage than caution purchased the world's most notorious diamond. The 45-carat blue stone had already left a trail of broken lives across continents. French kings beheaded, millionaires bankrupted, royalty driven mad. But Evalyn Walsh McLean, daughter of Colorado Gould, merely laughed at tales of ancient curses. She let her Great Dane wear the Hope Diamond like a trinket and flaunted it at baseball games, declaring herself immune to its dark history. Within decades, she would bury 2 of her children, watch her husband descend into madness, lose her family fortune, and discover, perhaps too late, why centuries of owners had feared the seductive blue light at the heart of her precious gem. In the rugged San Juan Mountains of Colorado, where prospectors sought their fortunes in the late 1800s, Thomas Walsh made the discovery that would transform his family's future. The Camp Bird mine, rich with gold and silver veins, proved to be one of the most profitable discoveries of the era, elevating the Walsh family from modest means to extraordinary wealth during America's Gilded Age. Born in 1886, Evalyn Walsh's early years coincided with her family's remarkable rise in fortune. Her father's journey from Irish immigrant to wealthy mine owner embodied the American dream, taking place during a time when new industrial fortunes were reshaping the nation's social landscape. Thomas Walsh's success meant that his daughter would grow up in circumstances far different from his own humble beginnings. The Walsh family's newfound wealth opened doors that would have been firmly closed to them just years before. Thomas Walsh, mindful of his daughter's future, invested in her education in Washington, D.C., where the family eventually established their residence. This move from the mining towns of Colorado to the nation's capital marked a significant transition in young Evalyn's life. As she grew older, Evalyn's world expanded beyond the western frontier of her early childhood. The family's relocation to Washington, D.C. placed them at the heart of American society and politics. Here, among the established families of the capital, the Walshes made their mark not just through their mining fortune, but through their active participation in the city's social and cultural life. It was in this environment that Evalyn met Edward "Ned" McLean, heir to the Washington Post publishing empire. Their courtship captured public attention, representing a union between 2 of America's prominent families. The impending marriage promised to combine the Walsh mining fortune with the McLean publishing empire, creating a union of considerable social and financial significance. Their 1908 wedding reflected the scale of both families' wealth. Each set of parents gave the couple $100,000 to purchase their own wedding presents, an extraordinary sum for the time that demonstrated both families' immense prosperity. The gesture spoke to the magnitude of wealth that would shape Evalyn's adult life and influence her future decisions. As the newlyweds embarked on their life together, neither could have anticipated how their future would become entwined with one of history's most famous gems. 2 years after their wedding, in 1910, they would encounter Pierre Cartier, a French jeweller who possessed a remarkable blue diamond. The 45.52-carat stone known as the Hope Diamond would soon capture Evalyn's imagination. The circumstances that would bring this extraordinary gem into Evalyn's possession and the role it would play in her life were about to unfold. As she stood on the threshold of her new life as Mrs. McLean, Evalyn was entering a chapter that would define not just her own story, but the next stage in the Hope Diamond's long and storied journey through history. The first 2 years of Evalyn and Ned McLean's marriage unfolded against the backdrop of America's wealthiest social circles. With their combined family fortunes, the young couple enjoyed a lifestyle of exceptional privilege, dividing their time between Washington, D.C.'s social season and extended travels abroad. In 1910, while the McLeans were staying at their Paris hotel, Pierre Cartier arranged a meeting to show them an extraordinary gem, the Hope Diamond. Cartier, already renowned as a jeweller to European royalty and American millionaires, had recently acquired the stone and recognised the McLeans as potential buyers who could afford such a significant purchase. The 45.52-carat deep blue diamond that Cartier presented was distinctive not only for its size and colour, but also for its documented history of royal ownership. It had been part of the French crown jewels until the French Revolution, after which it disappeared for decades, eventually resurfacing in England in the 1830s when it was acquired by Henry Philip Hope, from whom it derived its current name. Through subsequent sales and inheritances, it had finally come into Cartier's possession. The meeting marked the beginning of what would become a lengthy negotiation process. The Hope diamond's unusual cushion cut and rare blue colour made it a unique piece, unlike anything else available in the market. While stories circulated about the stone bringing misfortune to its owners, these tales were part of the complex history Cartier shared with the McLeans during their discussions. The proposed price of $180,000 represented a significant investment, even for the wealthy McLeans. Ned McLean initially expressed reservations about the purchase, although he would eventually support his wife's decision to acquire the stone. The negotiation process would extend beyond their initial meeting, as both parties worked to reach terms that would satisfy everyone involved. The diamond's journey to that point had been remarkable. After disappearing during the French Revolution, it had passed through several hands before reaching Cartier. Each transfer of ownership added another layer to its already rich history, making it not just a precious gem, but a piece of tangible history. From the French royal family to Henry Philip Hope, and through subsequent owners, the diamond had travelled across continents and through the hands of some of Europe's most notable collectors. As 1910 drew to a close, the Hope diamond remained in Cartier's possession, but discussions about its sale to the McLeans continued. The negotiations would stretch into the following year, with various factors influencing the final decision. The complex discussions involved not just the price, but also considerations about the stone's setting and presentation. The question that hung in the balance wasn't simply whether the McLeans would acquire this remarkable blue diamond, but how this potential purchase might impact their lives. Little did they know that their decision would link their name permanently with one of history's most famous gems, creating a connection that would far outlast their own lifetimes. In 1911, after months of negotiations, the Hope diamond finally changed hands. The McLeans purchased the extraordinary blue stone from Cartier for $180,000, a sum equivalent to several $1 million today. This acquisition marked the beginning of a new chapter in the diamond's long history. The 45.52-carat blue diamond was reset by Cartier into a versatile headpiece that could also be worn as a pendant. This new setting allowed Evalyn to showcase the stone in various ways at social gatherings. She integrated the Hope diamond into her life with a casualness that contrasted sharply with its royal history and immense value. In one of her more notable displays of this informal attitude, she occasionally allowed her Great Dane to wear the diamond. The early years of Evalyn's ownership of the Hope diamond coincided with a period of significant social and political change in Washington, D.C. World War I would soon reshape the international landscape, and the McLeans' position at the intersection of media and society through their ownership of the Washington Post placed them at the centre of these transformative events. However, the family's prominent position and extraordinary wealth couldn't shield them from personal tragedy. In 1919, the McLeans suffered their first major loss when their 9-year-old son, Vincent, was struck by a car and killed. This devastating event marked the beginning of a series of personal challenges that would test Evalyn's strength in the years to come. The Hope diamond remained a significant part of Evalyn's life through both prosperous times and periods of hardship. Like many wealthy Americans, she would later face financial challenges during the Great Depression, even temporarily pawning the diamond during this difficult period. Yet throughout her decades of ownership, she maintained a special connection to the stone that distinguished her from its previous owners. As the 1920s approached, the McLeans' lives appeared to be following diverging paths. Ned's behaviour became increasingly erratic, marked by growing problems with alcohol and gambling that would strain their marriage. Meanwhile, Evalyn continued to maintain her position in Washington society, with the Hope Diamond serving as a constant presence in her life. The next decade would bring more changes and challenges for Evalyn Walsh McLean. The Roaring Twenties were about to begin, ushering in an era of unprecedented social change and economic expansion. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent prosperity, forces were at work that would test both her fortune and her spirit. The 1920s brought dramatic changes to American society, and the McLeans were not immune to the era's turbulent currents. While the decade began with the glittering excess of the Roaring Twenties, it would end with decisions and events that would fundamentally alter Evalyn's life. Ned McLean's struggles with alcohol and gambling intensified during this period, putting increasing strain on both their marriage and their finances. The situation reached a breaking point in 1927 when Evalyn separated from her husband. Despite their social prominence and the public nature of their positions as owners of the Washington Post, private troubles could no longer be contained within the walls of their mansion. The stock market crash of 1929 ushered in the Great Depression, bringing new financial challenges. Even the wealthy McLeans felt the impact of these difficult economic times. In a move that demonstrated how dire circumstances had become, Evalyn temporarily pawned the Hope Diamond during this period. This decision, likely difficult for someone who had maintained such a close connection to the stone, reflected the economic realities of the era. The 1930s brought even more significant changes. In 1933, Ned McLean was declared legally insane and committed to a mental hospital. That same year, the Washington Post, which had been in the McLean family for decades, was sold as part of the settlement of Edward McLean's estate. The newspaper that had been such a significant part of their family's identity and influence passed into new hands. Throughout these upheavals, Evalyn maintained her presence in Washington society, though in altered circumstances. The Hope Diamond, when not in pawn, remained a constant in her life. While many of her contemporaries faced similar financial reversals during the Depression, Evalyn's experience was particularly public due to her social prominence and connection to the famous Bluestone. The changes in Evalyn's life during this period reflected larger transformations in American society. The economic devastation of the Depression had reshaped the landscape of American wealth, and many formerly secure fortunes proved vulnerable to the harsh economic conditions. The sale of the Washington Post marked the end of an era not just for the McLean family, but for a certain style of newspaper ownership in America. As the 1930s progressed, Evalyn faced her challenges with the same spirit that had characterized her earlier years. While her life had changed dramatically from the days when she first acquired the Hope Diamond, she maintained her distinctive personality and social connections. The diamond, which had witnessed the fall of French royalty and the transformation of European society, now observed the reshaping of American wealth and society through the experiences of its owner. The years ahead would bring more changes for Evalyn Walsh McLean. Her ex-husband remained institutionalized, and the future held both additional sorrows and moments of strength. As she moved into the next phase of her life, the Hope Diamond would continue to play a unique role in her story, leading toward decisions that would ultimately determine the fate of this remarkable stone. The 1940s brought significant endings in the story of Evalyn Walsh McLean and the Hope Diamond. In 1941, Ned McLean died in the mental hospital where he had spent his final years. Though they had long been separated, his death marked the conclusion of a significant chapter in Evalyn's life, one that had begun with such promise at their 1908 wedding. The Hope Diamond remained in Evalyn's possession until her death, having been her companion through decades of dramatic change in both her personal life and the wider world. The jewel that had travelled from French royalty through various European collections had now been in Evalyn's possession longer than any other private owner. During her ownership, the stone had transformed from a piece of jewellery into something more, a tangible link to history and a symbol of endurance through challenging times. In 1947, Evalyn Walsh McLean passed away at the age of 60. Her life had spanned an extraordinary period in American history, from the mining fortunes of the Gilded Age through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. She had outlived her ex-husband and 2 of her children, enduring personal tragedies while maintaining her distinctive spirit. After her death, the Hope Diamond found a new path. The stone was sold to Harry Winston Inc., marking the end of its longest period of private ownership. Winston would display the famous diamond for the next decade as part of his Court of Jewels exhibition, travelling throughout the United States. Finally, in 1958, he donated it to the Smithsonian Institution, where it has remained ever since. Today, the Hope Diamond rests in the National Museum of Natural History, where millions of visitors each year pause to admire its deep blue brilliance. Its setting has been modified several times since Evalyn's day, but the stone itself remains unchanged, a tribute to both natural wonder and human history. The diamond's permanent home in the Smithsonian represents a remarkable final chapter in its long journey. The stone that once adorned French kings, that travelled through centuries of private collections, and that spent its longest period of private ownership with Evalyn, now belongs to the American public. In its secure display case, rotating slowly under carefully controlled lights, the Hope Diamond continues to captivate audiences just as it once captivated the mining heiress who owned it for over 3 decades. Power comes in many forms. There's the raw power of wealth, the kind that built America's railroads and forged its industrial empire. Then there's the subtler power of social change, the kind that reshapes societies from within. Mary Harriman Rumsey wielded both. Born into one of America's greatest fortunes, she could have lived a life of idle luxury. Instead, she chose to challenge the very system that created her privilege. Her journey from railroad princess to progressive champion would help reshape American society, until fate intervened in the most aristocratic way imaginable. In today's episode, I'll share the story of a woman who dared to transform inherited privilege into a force for social progress, only to pass by the most tragically wealthy of means. The progressive Gilded Age heiress who tragically died on horseback. The tale of Mary Harriman Rumsey. In the waning days of America's Gilded Age, where fortunes were built on steel rails and measured in miles of track, Mary Harriman emerged not as another idle heiress, but as a woman determined to reshape the meaning of privilege itself. Born on the 17th of November 1881, she grew up in the shadow of one of the most powerful men in American history. Her father, E.H. Harriman, the railroad titan who transformed the Union Pacific from a bankrupt liability into an empire of steel and steam. The grounds of Arden House, the family estate nestled in New York's Ramapo Mountains, became Mary's earliest classroom. While her father's railroads stretched across the continent, the estate itself grew to encompass 20,000 acres of carefully preserved wilderness, a symbol of the family's complex relationship with power and responsibility. Here, among the pristine forests and commanding views of the Hudson, Mary developed a worldview that would later challenge the very foundations of her privileged upbringing. Unlike many of her contemporaries, who viewed their position in society purely as a platform for social advancement, Mary found herself drawn to the progressive movements brewing beneath the gilded surface of American society. The contrast between Arden's manicured gardens and the harsh realities of industrial age America sparked something in the young woman that would later ignite into purpose. Her mother, Mary Williamson Averill Harriman, provided a powerful example of how wealth could be wielded for social good. The elder Mary, who would inherit E.H. Harriman's vast fortune estimated between $70 and $100 million upon his death in 1909, demonstrated that financial power could serve as a tool for positive change rather than mere self-indulgence. The young Mary's early life was marked by an unusual combination of privilege and purpose. While other debutantes focused solely on their social calendars, she found herself increasingly drawn to the emerging social sciences, particularly the field of sociology. This interest would later prove to be more than just a passing fancy of a wealthy young woman. It was the foundation of a life's mission. But it was through her involvement with the Junior League of New York that Mary first began to transform her progressive ideals into action. The organisation, comprised of young women from prominent families, worked to improve conditions in settlement houses, and advocate for social reforms. Under Mary's influence, what could have been merely a social club for wealthy women began to evolve into something far more potent. As the new century dawned and America entered a period of unprecedented social change, Mary stood at a crossroads. The death of her father in September 1909 marked not just the end of a railroad empire's first chapter, but the beginning of a new kind of influence that neither Wall Street nor New York society quite understood. While her mother took control of the vast Harriman fortune, Mary began to forge her own path, one that would lead her far from the expected role of a railroad baron's daughter. In the winter of 1910, she made a decision that would ripple through American society for decades to come. As she stood before the gates of Arden, watching snow blanket the Hudson Valley below, the 28-year-old heiress was preparing to unleash a new kind of power, one that would transform not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. As the 1910s dawned, Mary Harriman charted a course that diverged sharply from the expected path of a railroad baron's daughter. While her peers focused on maintaining social standing through elaborate parties and carefully arranged marriages, Mary sought to leverage her position for broader social impact. Her family name opened doors, but it was her determination that would ultimately define her legacy. The year 1910 marked a pivotal moment in Mary's life when she married Charles Carey Rumsey, a talented sculptor whose artistic vision complemented her pragmatic approach to social reform. The union raised eyebrows among New York's elite. A railroad heiress marrying an artist seemed almost revolutionary in those stratified times. The marriage proved to be a partnership that would strengthen both their individual pursuits. Their family grew quickly with the arrival of Charles Carey Rumsey Jr. in 1911, followed by Mary Averill Rumsey in 1913 and Bronson Harriman Rumsey in 1917. Motherhood, rather than distracting Mary from her social consciousness, seemed to sharpen it. The contrast between her children's privileged upbringing and the harsh realities faced by less fortunate families in New York City only intensified her drive to effect change. While her mother, Mary Williamson Averill Harriman, managed the vast family fortune and supported various causes, including the controversial eugenics record office, the younger Mary focused her energies on direct engagement with progressive reform movements. She understood that her generation faced unique challenges that couldn't be solved through traditional philanthropy alone. The Junior League of New York became her primary vehicle for action during these years. Under her influence, the organization evolved beyond its origins as a social club for debutantes into a serious force for social change. Mary helped redirect the energy and resources of young society women toward meaningful community service and advocacy for social reforms. As World War I erupted in Europe, Mary found new outlets for her organizational abilities through her work with the Council for National Defense. The crisis demanded a different kind of leadership, one that could mobilize resources and coordinate efforts across traditional social boundaries. Mary's experience with the Junior League had prepared her well for this expanded role in public service. Throughout these years, she maintained a careful balance between her public works and private life. The Rumsey household, while certainly comfortable, avoided the ostentatious displays common among New York's elite. Instead, Mary focused on instilling in her children the same sense of social responsibility that drove her own actions. But as the war years drew to a close, Mary began to envision a broader role for herself in American public life. The experience of coordinating wartime efforts had given her valuable insights into the mechanisms of social change at a national level. In the quiet moments between her many responsibilities, she began formulating plans that would soon carry her far beyond the traditional constraints of her social class. As 1919 approached, Mary stood poised on the brink of her most significant contribution to American society. The skills she had honed through years of progressive activism, combined with her unique position at the intersection of wealth and social reform, were about to find their most powerful expression yet. In a modest office in Washington, D.C., far from the marble halls of New York society, the next chapter of her remarkable journey was about to begin. The 1920s brought seismic shifts to American society, and Mary Harriman Rumsey positioned herself at the centre of this transformation. While many of her social peers retreated into the hedonistic embrace of the Jazz Age, Mary's focus remained steadfastly on social progress. Her work with the Junior League had evolved into a national movement, expanding from its New York roots to establish chapters across the country. But it was the stock market crash of 1929 that truly catalyzed Mary's most significant contributions to American society. As the nation reeled from economic catastrophe, she emerged as an unexpected bridge between the worlds of wealth and progressive reform. Her unique position, understanding both the mechanics of high finance through her family background and the realities of social needs through her reform work, made her an invaluable asset during a time of unprecedented economic crisis. Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had known Mary through New York social circles, recognized in her a rare combination of practical experience and progressive vision. In 1933, she accepted his appointment to chair the Consumer Advisory Board of the National Recovery Administration. The appointment marked a significant milestone. Few women held such positions of authority within the new administration, and none came from such a prominent background. The Consumer Advisory Board, under her leadership, tackled the complex challenge of balancing economic recovery with consumer protection. Mary approached her role with characteristic thoroughness, often working long hours to understand the intricate details of industrial codes and their impact on ordinary Americans. Her background as both a Harriman and a social reformer gave her unique insights into the delicate balance between business interests and public good. Frances Perkins, Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor and the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet, found common ground with Mary in their shared vision for economic justice. Their collaboration helped ensure that consumer interests weren't overlooked in the ambitious restructuring of the American economy. Mary's ability to navigate between different social spheres, from boardrooms to government offices, proved invaluable in building consensus for reform measures. Throughout 1934, Mary maintained a demanding schedule that divided her time between Washington and her other commitments. Her children, Charles Jr., 23, Mary Averill, 21, and Bronson, 17, witnessed their mother's dedication to public service, even as she remained devoted to her family responsibilities. The balancing act was challenging, but Mary approached it with the same determination that characterized all her endeavors. The autumn of 1934 found Mary deeply engaged in her work with the Consumer Advisory Board, while still pursuing her passion for horseback riding near her country home in Virginia. The rolling hills of Middleburg provided a welcome respite from the pressures of Washington, allowing her to indulge in the equestrian activities she had loved since childhood. As November turned to December, she continued to split her time between her government responsibilities and these cherished moments of recreation. As winter approached, Mary was at the height of her influence in Washington, respected across political lines for her practical approach to economic reform. The Consumer Advisory Board, under her leadership, had become an essential voice in the ongoing national recovery effort. But fate was about to intervene in a way that would transform her legacy from that of an active participant in the New Deal to a symbol of its early idealism. On a late autumn morning in Middleburg, Virginia, Mary mounted her horse for what would prove to be her final ride. The events that followed would cut short a remarkable career in public service and leave Roosevelt's administration without one of its most capable leaders at a crucial moment in the New Deal's evolution. In November 1934, the rolling hills of Middleburg, Virginia, echoed with the traditional sounds of fox hunting season. For Mary Harriman Rumsey, these hunts represented more than just sport. They were a connection to the aristocratic traditions she had both inherited and sought to reform through her public service. That autumn morning, as she joined the hunt on her Virginia farm, there was no indication that this familiar ritual would lead to tragedy. The fox hunt proceeded as normal until Mary's horse stumbled, throwing her to the ground with devastating force. The impact left her severely injured, and the woman who had helped shape the New Deal's early years now lay wounded on the same Virginia soil where she had so often found joy and respite from her demanding work in Washington. The news of her accident reverberated through the capital's corridors of power. As she fought for recovery in the weeks that followed, a steady stream of visitors made their way to her bedside. Cabinet members, reform advocates and family friends all came to pay their respects to the woman who had bridged so many worlds, from the heights of industrial wealth to the trenches of social reform. Initially, there was hope for recovery. Mary had always possessed a remarkable resilience, demonstrated throughout her life as she transformed from railroad heiress to progressive reformer. But as November turned to December, a new enemy emerged in her battle for survival. Pneumonia, a common and dangerous complication for bedridden patients in the era before antibiotics, began to take hold. During those December days, as Mary lay incapacitated, the work of the Consumer Advisory Board continued, though her absence was keenly felt. The organisation she had led with such dedication now served as a testament to her ability to build lasting institutions. Her colleagues carried on her work, even as they anxiously monitored reports of her condition. The cruel irony of her situation was not lost on those who knew her story. 12 years earlier, in September 1922, she had lost her husband, Charles Carey Rumsey, in a car accident. Now she faced her own mortality, leaving her 3 children, Charles Jr., Mary Averill and Bronson, to contemplate a future without either parent. On the 18th of December 1934, Mary Harriman Rumsey succumbed to pneumonia, her body unable to overcome the combined challenges of her injuries and infection. At 53 years and 1 month old, she had lived a life that defied the conventions of her class and era, yet died in a manner that eerily reflected the aristocratic traditions she had worked to reform. The timing of her death, coming at a crucial juncture in the New Deal's evolution, left many wondering how different the programme's implementation might have been had she lived. Her unique ability to understand both the concerns of business and the needs of consumers had made her an invaluable voice in policy discussions. As winter descended on Middleburg, the farm where she had taken her final ride stood as a quiet reminder of how quickly fate can alter the course of history. The woman who had worked so tirelessly to reshape America's economic landscape had been struck down not by political opposition or the exhaustion of her demanding schedule, but by the cruel twist of fate during a traditional fox hunt. In Washington, as her colleagues prepared for the challenges ahead without her leadership, a question lingered in the minds of many. How would her absence affect the delicate balance she had helped maintain between recovery and reform? The answer would soon become apparent as the New Deal entered its next crucial phase. The death of Mary Harriman Rumsey in December 1934 marked the end of a remarkable transformation, from railroad heiress to progressive reformer. Her passing came at a crucial moment in the New Deal's evolution, just as her work with the Consumer Advisory Board was beginning to shape the relationship between government, business, and the American consumer. Her legacy lived on through her 3 children, Charles Harriman Rumsey, Mary Averill Rumsey, and Bronson Harriman Rumsey. While their mother's time in public service had been brief, spanning just the crucial years of 1933 and 1934, her impact on the early New Deal programs demonstrated how wealth and social consciousness could work in tandem for the public good. The Junior League stood as perhaps her most enduring achievement. What began as a social organisation for debutantes had evolved, under her guidance, into a nationwide network dedicated to community service and social reform. This transformation reflected Mary's own journey from privilege to purpose, showing how traditional social institutions could be redirected toward progressive ends. As chair of the Consumer Advisory Board of the National Recovery Administration, she had brought a unique perspective to the challenges of economic recovery. Her background in both the world of industrial wealth and progressive reform allowed her to navigate the competing interests of business and consumers during a critical period of American history. Her death from complications following a riding accident came just as she was establishing herself in this new role. The timing was particularly poignant. Having found her voice in public service, she was struck down before she could fully realize her potential as a reformer. The woman who had worked to bridge the gap between America's industrial past and its progressive future would not live to see how this transformation played out. The Consumer Advisory Board continued its work after her passing, though without the unique perspective she had brought to its deliberations. As one of the few women in a leadership position during the early New Deal, she had helped demonstrate that gender need not be a barrier to effective public service, even if her time in office was cut tragically short. Looking back at the brief span between her appointment in 1933 and her death in 1934, we can see the outlines of what might have been. In just 18 months, she had begun to reshape how government approached consumer interests during economic recovery, bringing both practical knowledge and progressive ideals to bear on pressing national issues. The Virginia countryside, where she took her final ride, served as a powerful symbol of the two worlds she inhabited, the traditional aristocracy of her birth and the progressive future she worked to create. Her death during a recreational pursuit common to her social class, even as she worked to reform the economic system that had created that class, captured the complexities of her position in American society. Her story ultimately transcended the circumstances of her death, speaking to larger questions about privilege, responsibility, and the possibility of personal transformation. In her journey from railroad heiress to New Deal reformer, Mary Harriman Rumsey had demonstrated how inherited advantage could be redirected toward public service, even if her own opportunity to pursue this path was cut tragically short. Imagine what it would feel like to be a Gilded Age heiress, your very movements choreographed by centuries of social expectation. For Dorothy Arnold, each day began with the weight of the Arnold name, a name that opened every door in Manhattan society, while simultaneously closing others. Her life was a parade of exquisite moments: shopping expeditions down Fifth Avenue, literary pursuits at prestigious schools, and secret romantic correspondences to suitors delivered on expensive stationery. Indeed, she played her part perfectly, floating through high society in velvet hats adorned with silk roses, her black fox muff keeping her gloved hands warm as she stepped into luxury shops where even the air seemed perfumed with privilege. Yet beneath this carefully maintained facade of wealth and propriety lay the stirrings of rebellion, of dreams that couldn't be bought, dreams that would lead her toward a destiny no one could have predicted on that fateful December afternoon in 1910. In today's episode, we'll share the enduring mystery of her disappearance, from the facts of the case to the wildest of theories, as we describe. The Gilded Age heiress who disappeared, the mystery of Dorothy Arnold. In the grand mansions of Gilded Age New York, where gaslight cast long shadows across marble floors and secrets whispered behind silk fans, Dorothy Arnold was born into a world where everything had its price, but true freedom remained beyond purchase. The second of 4 children, she emerged into life on the 1st of July 1885, destined to bear the weight of the Arnold name, a name that opened every door in Manhattan society, yet somehow managed to close just as many around her. And her father, Francis R. Arnold, had built his fortune on the delicate scents of imported perfumes, those invisible tendrils of luxury that wrapped themselves around the necks of society's finest ladies. From his offices at F.R. Arnold & Co., he crafted not merely a business, but a dynasty, one that reached its marble-clad fingers all the way to the Supreme Court through Dorothy's aunt's marriage to Justice Rufus W. Peckham. In fact, the Arnolds could trace their blood back to the Mayflower itself, old money mixing with new in that peculiarly American alchemy that defined the age. And the family mansion at 108 East 79th Street stood as a monument to their ascension, its rooms filled with the heavy breath of wealth, mahogany panels that had crossed oceans to line their walls, Persian carpets that muffled the sound of servants' footsteps, crystal chandeliers that caught and multiplied the light until it seemed the very air sparkled with privilege. Yet within these gilded walls, Dorothy felt the increasing weight of expectations pressing against her chest like a too-tight corset. At the Veltin School for Girls, she learned to move through society like a queen, her chin held at precisely the right angle to suggest both breeding and approachability. And at Bryn Mawr, she dared to dream of something more. Literature and language opened doors to worlds beyond the suffocating parlours of Fifth Avenue. She began to write, pouring her soul onto paper in secret moments between social obligations. But when her stories returned with rejection letters, her family's amusement cut deeper than any editor's criticism. Still, she persisted. In the autumn of 1910, Dorothy began spending more time alone, making mysterious trips downtown. Her father's refusal to let her move to Greenwich Village, that bohemian refuge of artists and intellectuals, only strengthened her resolve. No one who saw her on a crisp December day shortly thereafter could have known that, as she walked away from a candy shop, each click of her heels on the sidewalk was counting down to one of the most baffling disappearances in New York history. The morning of the 12th of December 1910 dawned cold and clear in Manhattan, the kind of crystalline winter day when footsteps echo sharply off brownstone facades and even the air seems to hold its breath. Dorothy Arnold emerged from the family mansion at 108 East 79th Street, wearing a tailored blue suit that whispered of wealth with every movement. Her black velvet hat, adorned with silk roses the colour of twilight, cast delicate shadows across her face, shadows that would soon become permanent in the photographs plastered across newspapers nationwide. In her leather purse lay $25 in crisp bills, a fortune to most at the time, but mere pocket money to an Arnold. The money nestled beside a letter, its contents known only to Dorothy, the paper worn at its creases from repeated reading. This was not the first such letter. Others had arrived over the preceding months, each one bearing a Boston postmark and the distinctive handwriting of George Griscom Jr., whose very name made Frances Arnold's jaw tighten with disapproval. The streets of Manhattan stretched before her that morning like the chapters of an unwritten novel. Fifth Avenue glittered with promise, its shop windows displaying treasures that Dorothy barely noticed as she made her way south. At Park and Tilford, she purchased a box of chocolates, the kind she had always favoured, wrapped in paper that crinkled with elegant restraint. The sound would echo in the memory of the shop girl who served her, becoming part of the tapestry of last moments that investigators would later weave together. At Brentano's bookstore, the warmth of literary sanctuary embraced her. Here, among the leather-bound volumes and fresh ink, Dorothy selected engaged girl sketches, a choice that would later be dissected for hidden meaning by dozens of detectives. The book's pages held stories of love and marriage, subjects that had become increasingly complicated in Dorothy's own life since her secret meetings with Griscom in Boston. As she left the bookstore, Manhattan's winter light was already beginning to fade, though it was not yet afternoon. Dorothy's figure, elegant in blue, merged with the crowd of holiday shoppers. She moved toward Central Park, where bare trees reached toward a steel-grey sky like grasping fingers. The park's winding paths offered silent witness to countless clandestine meetings and whispered promises, but whatever secrets they might have held about Dorothy's fate remained locked in winter's frozen embrace. Back at the mansion, the hours began their inexorable march toward evening. The family's dinner hour approached with its usual precision, silver being laid, wine being decanted, servants moving with practiced efficiency through rooms growing steadily darker. But Dorothy's chair would remain empty, her absence at first a mere ripple in the carefully orchestrated rhythm of upper-class life. That ripple would soon become a wave, threatening to overwhelm the carefully constructed facade of Arnold family propriety. For as the evening shadows lengthened across Fifth Avenue's fashionable flagstones, Dorothy Arnold, heiress, aspiring writer, secret romantic, had already stepped into a mystery that would haunt New York society for generations to come. For 6 weeks after Dorothy Arnold vanished, silence wrapped itself around the Arnold mansion like winter fog. Behind heavy curtains and massive oak doors, the family's private agony played out in whispered conversations and furtive meetings with John S. Keith, their trusted lawyer, whose discreet inquiries had yielded nothing but shadows. The family's pride, that great fortress built of old money and older connections, had become their prison. Frances Arnold, who had built an empire on imported perfumes and social connections, found himself facing an enemy that neither wealth nor influence could defeat. Each morning he descended the mansion's marble staircase with ever greyer features, the weight of his decision to protect the family name bearing down upon him with the inexorable force of approaching disaster. The servants moved through the house like ghosts, careful to avert their eyes from empty chairs and untouched place settings. Mary Martha Arnold maintained her social calendar with mechanical precision, each tea party and charity meeting a masterclass in composed desperation. Behind her perfect smile lay the growing certainty that every passing hour without police involvement pushed her daughter further beyond reach. Yet the spectre of scandal, that great destroyer of Gilded Age fortunes, kept her lips sealed and her gloved hands folded properly in her lap. When they finally broke their silence on the 25th of January 1911, the press descended like vultures on fresh prey. The Arnold mansion became the epicenter of a media earthquake that sent shockwaves through every drawing room from Fifth Avenue to Newport. Reporters prowled the sidewalks, their pencils sharp as knives, ready to carve the family's reputation into headlines that would sell papers from coast to coast. The press conference, held in the very parlour where Dorothy had last bid goodbye to her mother, transformed their private nightmare into public theatre. Francis Arnold stood before the flashbulbs, his dignity crumbling like ancient marble as he offered $1,000 for information about his daughter's whereabouts, a sum that seemed paltry against the $100,000 he would eventually spend chasing shadows. Across the nation, Dorothy's face stared out from newspaper pages and police circulars, her story feeding America's growing appetite for mystery and tragedy among the privileged classes. From Philadelphia's railway stations to San Antonio's dusty streets, reported sightings bloomed like desert flowers after rain, beautiful, brief, and ultimately false. The Pinkerton detectives, those shadows among shadows, followed countless leads that dissolved into nothing. Ransom notes arrived, each one raising hopes only to dash them against the rocks of deception. Even Joseph P.K. Leonard's lurid confession of witnessing Dorothy's demise proved to be nothing more than the fabrication of a desperate mind. But perhaps most telling was what remained in Dorothy's room, untouched since that December morning. Her evening clothes, her jewellery, her diary filled with secrets about George Griscom Jr., all the precious detritus of a life interrupted, and there on her writing desk lay a half-finished manuscript, its pages forever waiting for an ending that would never come. Time moves forward with relentless precision, but some mysteries refuse to fade into history's shadows. In the decades following Dorothy Arnold's disappearance, theories bloomed like dark flowers in the garden of public imagination, each one reaching toward its own version of truth. The ransom notes arrived like poison pen letters, demanding $5,000 for Dorothy's return, a paltry sum for an Arnold, yet still too much for truth. These missives, scrawled by opportunists who sought to profit from a family's desperation, only deepened the mystery they pretended to solve. Each fraudulent demand drove another nail into the coffin of the kidnapping theory until it lay buried beneath the weight of its own improbability. In the marble-floored parlours of New York society, whispers of suicide drifted like perfume through the air. Those who knew Dorothy spoke of her rejected manuscripts, those paper children she had sent into the world only to have them return unwanted. They mentioned the weight of expectations that had pressed upon her shoulders, heavier than any fur coat she had ever worn. Some pointed to her letters to George Griscom Jr., where disappointment bled through the ink, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Griscom himself became both suspect and theorist, his week with Dorothy in Boston, a chapter that society matrons read between the lines with raised eyebrows and knowing glances. He spoke of her despondency over her failed literary ambitions, of dark hints in her correspondence that suggested an ending she might have written herself. Yet no body was ever found in Central Park's winter bare landscape. No unidentified woman matched her description in any of Manhattan's morgues. The elopement theory gained traction in certain circles, fueled by Dorothy's secret Boston rendezvous and her family's iron-fisted control over her life. Some imagined her on a steamer bound for Europe, her tailored blue suit exchanged for a new identity, her black fox muff traded for the warm embrace of freedom. But this romantic notion, like all the others, dissolved under the harsh light of investigation. As the years passed, Dorothy Arnold's disappearance became more than just another society scandal. It emerged as a dark mirror reflecting the anxieties of an age. In her story, the public found every fear that haunted the Gilded Age: the vulnerability of wealth, the price of rebellion against social constraints, the thin veneer of security that separated the highest echelons of society from the abyss of uncertainty. Francis Arnold went to his grave in 1922, believing his daughter had ended her own life, taking with him whatever secrets he might have held about those 6 weeks of silence. Mary Martha Arnold followed in 1928, her final years marked by the daily ritual of watching her front door, waiting for a return that never came. The case files gathered dust in police archives, their pages yellowing like autumn leaves. Yet Dorothy Arnold's disappearance refused to be relegated to history's footnotes. Her story continues to whisper through time, a reminder that even in an age when wealth could buy almost anything, some questions remained forever beyond purchase, some mysteries eternally unsolved. Picture yourself at 17, wearing a silk gown worth a kingdom, tears soaking your pillow the night before your wedding. Your mother has just threatened to have the man you actually love killed. Tomorrow, you'll marry a duke you barely know, trading your happiness for a coronet. This isn't the beginning of a Gothic novel. It's the true story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, the reluctant duchess whose journey from gilded prisoner to independent woman would rewrite the rules of society. When they called her the most beautiful debutante in America, they didn't realize they were describing a masterpiece trapped in its own frame. This is the story of how wealth beyond imagination became chains of gold, and how one woman's rebellion against the glittering cage of the Gilded Age would inspire generations. On the 2nd of March 1877, as America's Gilded Age reached its glittering zenith, Consuelo Vanderbilt entered life bearing the weight of expectations that would nearly crush her spirit. Born into America's wealthiest family, she emerged from childhood carrying both extraordinary beauty and invisible chains, a combination that would shape her destiny in ways both magnificent and tragic. Alva Vanderbilt, her mother, wielded ambition like a weapon, carving out the family's place in society with the same ruthless determination that her husband William Kissam Vanderbilt used to expand their railroad empire. Young Consuelo, blessed with a swan-like neck, luminous eyes, and an ethereal grace that turned heads wherever she went, became her mother's masterpiece in making. Every breath, every gesture, every word was sculpted according to Alva's exacting standards. The limestone mansion at 65th Avenue, where Consuelo spent her formative years, served as both palace and prison. Within its opulent walls, she endured a rigorous education that went far beyond the typical finishing school curriculum. Alva's iron will shaped every aspect of her daughter's upbringing, from deportment to discourse, moulding her into the perfect vessel for the family's social aspirations. The physical and emotional demands of this grooming paled in comparison to the psychological conditioning that accompanied it, constant reminders that the Vanderbilt name carried obligations that superseded personal happiness. As Consuelo grew, her mother's plans crystallized with frightening precision. Alva had not invested years of careful cultivation merely to see her daughter marry into American society. No, she had grander ambitions. A European title that would elevate the Vanderbilts above their nouveau riche peers. The fact that American heiresses had begun trading fortunes for coronets in what the press dubbed the dollar princess phenomenon only strengthened Alva's resolve. When Consuelo made her society debut in 1895, she set New York ablaze with speculation. Her grace and beauty made the other debutantes seem coarse by comparison. Her regal bearing seemed to presage her future role. But behind the carefully orchestrated appearances, behind the silk gowns and practiced smiles, a quiet rebellion was brewing. Consuelo had formed an attachment to a New York socialite, Winthrop Rutherford, whose lack of title made him unacceptable in Alva's calculating eyes. The summer season brought a whirlwind of social engagements, each one carefully orchestrated by Alva, to position her daughter for the grand finale she had planned. As summer faded into autumn, whispers began circulating through Newport and New York about negotiations with a cash-strapped English duke. Consuelo, drowning in her mother's ambitions, found herself swept toward a fate she never chose, her own desires as irrelevant as last season's fashions. That autumn, as Manhattan's elite gathered in their Fifth Avenue mansions to trade gossip over tea, Alva Vanderbilt prepared to play her final hand in the game of social advancement. And the stakes were her daughter's heart and happiness, though such considerations seemed trivial compared to the glittering prize of a ducal coronet. Through the gilded halls of New York society, speculation mounted as November approached, each whispered conversation carrying the weight of impending transformation. In November 1895, as autumn's last leaves clung desperately to Manhattan's trees, Consuelo Vanderbilt faced the most devastating battle of her young life. Behind the magnificent doors of her family's Fifth Avenue mansion, Alva Vanderbilt orchestrated what would become known as one of the most ruthless matrimonial campaigns in American social history. The Duke of Marlborough had arrived in New York that fall, his ancient title burnished, but his coffers empty. Charles Spencer Churchill, known since childhood as Sonny, came seeking what so many of his peers sought in America: a fortune to restore his crumbling ancestral seat, Blenheim Palace. In Consuelo, he found not only extraordinary beauty and impeccable breeding, but also the vast Vanderbilt wealth that could save his estate. The young heiress's resistance to the match sparked a domestic siege that would haunt her for decades. Alva, determined to secure a duchess's coronet for her daughter, employed tactics that shocked even their jaded social circle. When Consuelo's heart turned toward Winthrop Rutherford, Alva's rage knew no bounds. She even threatened to have the young man killed. Through emotional manipulation and relentless pressure, she wore down her daughter's resistance until the inevitable surrender. On the morning of the 6th of November, 1895, New York witnessed what the press dubbed the wedding of the century. St. Thomas Church overflowed with society's elite, the cream of American and European aristocracy gathering to witness the union. Yet few among the assembled guests could see the tears that had soaked Consuelo's pillow the night before, or sense the deep despair beneath her composed exterior. As she walked down the aisle in her Worth gown, her face partially concealed by a delicate veil, Consuelo carried the weight of her mother's ruthless ambition. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of social theatre, with Bishop Henry Codman Potter officiating as the Duke awaited his American bride. The wedding breakfast that followed at the Vanderbilt mansion featured a guest list that read like a complete edition of the social register. Yet amid the champagne toasts and celebratory fanfare, the newly minted Duchess of Marlborough remained oddly silent, her thoughts perhaps dwelling on what might have been. The price of this social triumph was calculated in cold numbers: a dowry of $2.5 million in railroad stock, a staggering sum equivalent to over $75 million in today's currency. The human cost, the sacrifice of a young woman's happiness and free will, went unrecorded in the society columns that breathlessly detailed every aspect of the celebration. In the weeks that followed, as Consuelo prepared for her new life in England, Manhattan's drawing rooms buzzed with speculation about the match. Some praised Alva's brilliant manoeuvring, while others whispered about the ruthlessness of her methods. But none could deny that she had achieved her ultimate goal. Her daughter would cross the Atlantic, not as another wealthy American bride, but as her Grace, the Duchess of Marlborough. As the newlyweds departed for England, leaving behind the glimmer of New York society, autumn storms battered the Atlantic. The turbulent crossing seemed an apt metaphor for the upheaval that awaited the reluctant Duchess in her new homeland, where ancient traditions and aristocratic expectations would test the limits of her endurance. Blenheim Palace rose before Consuelo in the late autumn of 1895, its massive facade a monument to centuries of aristocratic power. The seat of the Dukes of Marlborough stood as both a triumph of English Baroque architecture and a crushing symbol of the responsibilities that now lay upon her young shoulders. The American-born Duchess found herself mistress of one of England's grandest estates, its vast rooms and endless corridors, the weight of tradition she was expected to uphold. The crisis facing Blenheim was immediate and severe. Years of neglect had left the palace in a state of elegant decay that even its magnificent architecture could no longer disguise. Water damage threatened priceless tapestries, while entire wings stood empty, their furnishings sold off by previous generations. The marriage settlement, which provided an annual income of $100,000 to the Duke and an additional $100,000 to Consuelo, would soon be put to use, funding extensive renovations that would save this architectural treasure from ruin. Yet even as she threw herself into the restoration of Blenheim, Consuelo discovered that renovating a palace was far easier than building a marriage. The Duke, while unfailingly polite, maintained an emotional distance that grew more pronounced with each passing month. Their union, founded on mutual duty rather than affection, settled into a pattern of elaborate courtesy that masked profound loneliness on both sides. Motherhood arrived with mechanical precision, as demanded by duty. The birth of their first son, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, in 8 fulfilled the primary obligation of a duchess, providing an heir to the dukedom. A second son, Lord Ivor Spencer Churchill, followed in 1898, completing the expected heir and spare. The children brought moments of joy to Consuelo's life, but they could not fill the emotional void at the heart of her marriage. The young Duchess found her true calling in the role of social reformer. She threw herself into philanthropic works with an energy that surprised and sometimes scandalized traditional aristocratic circles. Under her direction, Blenheim became a centre for progressive social initiatives. She established programs for the estate's workers and their families, including housing improvements and educational opportunities. Her work with London's poor, particularly unwed mothers and their children, revealed a compassion that transcended class boundaries. In English society, Consuelo's beauty and natural grace made her a sensation. The American Duchess brought a fresh vitality to the often staid world of the British aristocracy, her presence at social functions drawing attention and admiration. Yet beneath the surface, success lay a growing awareness that she had traded one gilded cage for another. The Duke, meanwhile, pursued his own interests and companionship elsewhere. Their public appearances together became increasingly formal affairs, choreographed to maintain the appearance of marital harmony while masking the reality of their estrangement. The palace that had once seemed like a fairy tale setting began to feel more like an elaborate stage set for a performance neither of them believed in anymore. As the new century dawned, bringing with it winds of social change, Consuelo began to question the bargain that had brought her to Blenheim. The price of her title, her freedom, her happiness, her very sense of self seemed increasingly steep. The restoration of Blenheim was progressing, but the woman who had helped save it was quietly crumbling behind her perfect Duchess facade. In 1906, the facade finally began to crack, and the comfortable fiction of the Marlboroughs' marriage could no longer withstand the pressure of their mutual unhappiness. The Duchess, who had once been America's most celebrated bride, was about to scandalize society once again, this time by choosing her own path. The Marlboroughs' separation in 1906 marked the end of what society had once heralded as the perfect union of Old World nobility and New World wealth. For Consuelo, now 29, the decision to separate marked the beginning of a profound personal transformation, though the legal bonds would take many more years to fully dissolve. In the aftermath of the separation, Consuelo emerged from the shadows of her imposed role to discover her own voice. No longer bound by the strict protocols of her position as Duchess of Marlborough, she threw herself into causes that reflected her true passions. Her work with the Women's Municipal Party in London revealed a keen political mind that had long been masked by her social duties. The suffragette movement found in her an eloquent advocate, her own experience of powerlessness lending authenticity to her support for women's rights. The years following the separation saw Consuelo flourish in unexpected ways. She established herself as a formidable public speaker, addressing crowds on social reform and women's suffrage. Her philanthropic work expanded, focusing particularly on improving conditions for women and children in London's most deprived areas. The woman who had once been valued primarily for her beauty and wealth proved herself a capable organiser and passionate advocate for social change. When World War I erupted in 1914, Consuelo channeled her organisational skills into vital war relief efforts. As chair of the Economic Relief Committee for the American Women's War Relief Fund, she worked tirelessly to aid those affected by the conflict. Her efforts during these years earned recognition from both the British government and international relief organisations, establishing her as a leader in humanitarian causes. Throughout these years, she maintained a dignified silence about her marriage, even as society buzzed with speculation. The Duke had his own life now, and Consuelo found herself increasingly drawn to a different future. In Jacques Balsan, a French pioneer of balloon and airplane aviation, she discovered the possibility of a love based on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than social obligation. The long path to divorce finally concluded in 1921. The legal dissolution of her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough marked not just the end of a union, but the beginning of Consuelo's true independence. The Duke would later petition for an annulment from the Anglican Church, with Consuelo's consent, a process that would reach its conclusion in 1926. The annulment would validate what she had known all along, that her consent to the marriage had never been freely given. The years between separation and divorce had transformed the once dutiful Duchess into a woman of substance and independence. Her beauty, which had once been her primary currency in society's marriage market, was now merely one aspect of a complex and accomplished personality. The skills she had developed as a young Duchess were now directed toward meaningful charitable initiatives, while her experience of arranged marriage made her a powerful voice for women's autonomy. As the post-war world emerged from the ashes of conflict, Consuelo stood ready to embrace a new chapter in her life. The woman who had once walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church in tears now faced her future with clear-eyed determination. The price of her freedom had been high, but its value was beyond measure. In 1921, at the age of 44, Consuelo Vanderbilt began her second act. Her marriage to Jacques Balsan marked not just a new union, but the triumph of personal choice over social obligation. Unlike the theatrical spectacle of her first wedding, this ceremony celebrated a genuine connection between two people who had chosen each other freely. The contrast could not have been more profound. Where the young Duchess had once walked down the aisle in tears, Consuelo Balsan now moved forward with quiet joy. The years with Jacques proved transformative. Their shared life between France and America allowed Consuelo to bridge the two worlds that had shaped her existence. At their French estate, Château Saint-Georges Motel, she created the kind of home that Blenheim, for all its grandeur, had never been. The gardens she designed there reflected her mature taste, free from the constraints of aristocratic tradition. Her relationship with her sons, John and Ivor, evolved and deepened through the years, demonstrating that maternal bonds could survive and even thrive beyond the confines of a failed marriage. The 1930s brought new challenges as Europe darkened under the shadow of fascism. When France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, the Balsans were forced to flee, leaving behind their beloved chateau. They made their way to America, where Consuelo once again demonstrated her resilience. During these years, she channeled her energy into supporting the Free French movement and various relief organizations aiding European refugees. In 1953, Consuelo published her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold. The book offered more than just a glimpse into the vanished world of the Gilded Age. It served as a thoughtful meditation on privilege, duty, and the high price of social ambition. With remarkable candour, she detailed her mother's ruthless machinations and her own journey from powerless young bride to independent woman. The memoir became a bestseller, introducing a new generation to her story. Throughout these later years, Consuelo maintained a dignified relationship with her first husband. When the Duke of Marlborough died in 1934, she penned a touching tribute to him, acknowledging their shared history while celebrating how far they both had come from their ill-fated beginning. Her own mother, Alva, had testified during the annulment proceedings, acknowledging her role in forcing her daughter into the marriage, a final confirmation of what Consuelo had always known. The woman who emerged in these decades bore little resemblance to the frightened teenage bride of 1895. Her beauty, once her primary asset in society's eyes, had matured into an elegant grace that reflected her inner development. The skills she had learned managing Blenheim found expression in her charitable work and the management of her own estates. The diplomatic abilities she had developed navigating aristocratic society served her well in her humanitarian efforts. The loss of her son Ivor in 1956 marked a profound personal tragedy in her later years. Yet Consuelo maintained her strength and dignity, continuing her charitable work and maintaining close ties with her remaining family. She had learned long ago that life's greatest challenges often led to unexpected forms of growth. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan died on the 6th of December 1964 in Southampton, Long Island. She was 87 years old and had lived to see the world of her youth, with its rigid social hierarchies and arranged marriages, fade into history. Her legacy lived on not in titles or coronets, but in the example she set of a woman who had found the courage to chart her own course. In the end, her story transcended the familiar narrative of an American heiress trading wealth for a title. Instead, it became something far more compelling. The journey of a woman who had transformed a gilded cage into a launching pad for a life of substance and meaning. The reluctant Duchess had become, at last, simply herself. The most dangerous people aren't the ones who choose a side. They're the ones who choose them all. And in the roaring social scene of 1920s Paris, Florence Gould perfected this delicate dance, transforming herself from a San Francisco publisher's daughter into a railroad heiress, art collector, and cultural power broker whose influence would span continents and survive wars. Indeed, her legendary salons would host artists and intellectuals, Nazi officers and resistance fighters, as she played a dangerous game of survival that would ultimately lead to both infamy and enduring cultural influence. On today's episode, we share not just another tale of a society hostess caught in history's crossfire. We tell you the story of a woman who saw opportunity in chaos, who understood that in times of war, morality becomes a luxury few can afford, as we describe Florence Gould, the American socialite who owned Paris. The rhythmic clatter of cable cars echoed through the financial district of San Francisco in 1895 as Maximilien Lacaze, a French publisher who had transplanted his family to America, welcomed his daughter Florence into a world of stark contrasts. The city, perched between the raw frontier and civilized society, perfectly embodied the dualities that would come to define his daughter's remarkable life. Young Florence inhabited two worlds from her earliest days. In the family's San Francisco home, her mother maintained the traditions of their French heritage, serving as a bridge between the old world and the new. The Lacaze household operated on a curious blend of American and French customs, with Florence absorbing both cultures with extraordinary ease. By age 10, she could shift effortlessly between proper French manners and American directness, a skill that would serve her well in decades to come. The 1906 earthquake that devastated San Francisco proved a pivotal moment in Florence's development. As flames consumed the city's grandest neighborhoods, 11-year-old Florence witnessed the transformation of her world. The sight of San Francisco's wealthiest citizens reduced to refugee status left an indelible impression. In later years, her friends would recall her frequent references to that morning, when she learned that survival often meant knowing when to abandon a sinking ship. Florence's education reflected her dual heritage. Her schooling in San Francisco provided a foundation in American culture, while her family's French connections kept her tethered to her European roots. Her quick wit and remarkable memory made her a natural student of human nature. Teachers noted her unusual ability to identify and exploit social opportunities, though they couched this observation in more diplomatic terms. As she matured, Florence developed a striking beauty that matched her calculated approach to life. The end of the Great War in 1918 brought new possibilities for a young woman of her ambition. Feeling constrained by San Francisco society and yearning for broader horizons, she made a bold decision that would alter the course of her life. She set sail for France, ostensibly to serve as a nurse in the war's aftermath, though her true ambitions reached far beyond humanitarian service. In Paris, she would reinvent herself, eventually even adjusting the spelling of her surname to Lacaze to enhance its aristocratic appeal. What began as a temporary adventure would transform into a decades-long saga that would scandalize European society. As she departed San Francisco's familiar shores, few suspected that this daughter of a French publisher would become one of the most notorious American expatriates in Paris, or that her path would soon cross with Frank J. Gould, heir to one of America's greatest railroad fortunes. The society columns noted her departure as a minor event, but none could predict the extraordinary story that would unfold once Florence set foot in post-war Paris. As she steamed toward Europe, leaving behind her carefully constructed American identity, she carried with her an ambition that would reshape both her destiny and the social landscape of the French Riviera. Post-war Paris pulsed with an electric energy that suited Florence Lacaze perfectly. Having arrived as a nurse, she quickly traded her uniform for sequins, finding work as a showgirl in the city's glittering nightclubs. Already well connected in Parisian society, she moved effortlessly between the city's artistic circles and social elites, building a network that would serve her for decades to come. It was in this heady atmosphere that Florence's path crossed with Frank J. Gould, heir to the vast Gould Railroad fortune and 18 years her senior. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of 1920s Paris, culminating in their 1923 marriage. While Florence had already established herself in French society, the Gould name and fortune added considerable weight to her social position, opening new avenues for her ambitions. The newlyweds shared a passion for French culture, particularly the arts. Together they began building an impressive collection of French Impressionist paintings, their shared appreciation for fine art forming a cornerstone of their partnership. Their social gatherings became known for their perfect blend of intellectual discourse and artistic appreciation, attracting writers, artists, and musicians alongside diplomats and industrialists. The Hôtel Provençal marked another chapter in Florence's ascent through French society. Perched above the Mediterranean in Juan-les-Pins, the hotel embodied everything Florence aspired to create, a sophisticated haven where the international elite could mingle freely. Under her guidance, the property became a gathering place where titled Europeans danced until dawn with Hollywood stars, and cultural boundaries dissolved in the warm Mediterranean air. Her marriage to Frank J. Gould operated on unconventional terms. Their arrangement allowed both partners considerable personal freedom, reflecting the liberal attitudes of their artistic and social circles. Florence moved through Parisian society with confidence, her charm and intelligence making her a sought-after presence at the most exclusive gatherings. Throughout the 1920s, Florence and Frank continued to expand their influence in French society. Their growing art collection reflected both their refined taste and their understanding of art's cultural significance. They developed close relationships with gallery owners and artists, establishing themselves as significant patrons of the arts in France. As the decade drew to a close and economic uncertainty loomed over Europe, Florence had secured her position within French society. Yet even as she presided over her sophisticated world of art and culture, more ominous changes were brewing across the continent. The woman who had so successfully navigated the intricacies of Parisian high society was about to face unprecedented challenges, ones that would test not only her legendary adaptability, but also force her to make choices that would echo through history. When German forces entered Paris in June 1940, most wealthy Americans fled the city. Florence Gould was not among them. Rather than securing passage home, she seized the dark opportunities that occupation presented. As Paris adjusted to German control, Florence's salon transformed into something far more significant than a mere cultural gathering. It became a hub of collaboration with the new regime. Every Wednesday afternoon, her apartment doors would open to a gathering that reflected her clear allegiance to the occupying force. While French intellectuals like Jean Cocteau, Marcel Jouhandeau, and Jean-Paul Hun still attended, they now shared space with German officers, including the writer Ernst Junger. These were not innocent literary gatherings, but calculated affairs where Florence cultivated relationships that would prove financially beneficial under the new order. Her collaboration extended far beyond hosting salons. As other businesses throughout Paris struggled under the crushing weight of occupation, Florence's ventures thrived through her willingness to engage in financial schemes that supported Nazi interests. Her operations included money laundering activities that would later draw intense scrutiny from investigators. The luxuries that flowed through her establishments during years of widespread privation spoke to the depth of her cooperation with occupation authorities. The growth of her art collection during this period reflected the darker aspects of occupation. As Jewish collectors were forced to flee or face deportation, Florence acquired new pieces under circumstances that would later raise serious questions about their provenance. The art market under occupation offered opportunities for those willing to ignore the human cost of their acquisitions, and Florence proved herself remarkably willing to overlook such ethical concerns in pursuit of her collection's expansion. Her financial activities during these years revealed a pattern of deliberate collaboration. Money moved through her various enterprises in support of Nazi interests, creating a complex web of transactions that would later attract the attention of investigators. Yet even as she actively participated in the occupation economy, she maintained her characteristic Sphinx-like demeanor, treating these activities as mere business decisions rather than the moral choices they represented. As liberation approached in 1944, Florence's position became increasingly precarious. When Allied forces neared Paris, her years of collaboration with the occupation forces placed her in serious jeopardy. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, French authorities began investigating her role during the occupation years, and she faced potential charges of high treason. While she ultimately avoided conviction due to insufficient evidence for a legal case, rather than any clever maneuvering on her part, the investigation cast a long shadow over her reputation. Documents about her wartime activities accumulated in Swiss banks, creating a paper trail that would eventually reveal the extent of her collaboration with the occupation regime. As Paris emerged from the shadow of occupation, Florence Gould faced the challenge of surviving in a city eager to punish collaborators. But even as she worked to distance herself from her wartime activities, the evidence of her choices during those dark years was already safely preserved in Swiss vaults, documents that would eventually expose the true nature of her relationship with the Nazi regime. The liberation of Paris in 1944 forced Florence Gould to confront the consequences of her wartime collaboration. Despite investigations into her activities with Nazi officials and facing potential treason charges, she embarked on a calculated campaign to rehabilitate her tarnished reputation. The strategy she devised would rely heavily on cultural philanthropy to obscure her wartime past. Her salon continued, though its nature had been irrevocably exposed by the occupation years. The same room that had hosted German officers now served as a testament to her survival instincts, rather than any genuine cultural leadership. While some literary figures like Paul Léotot and Jean-Paul Hahn still attended, their presence could not erase the memory of her wartime associations. The gatherings now carried the weight of recent history, despite attempts to focus conversation elsewhere. Florence's substantial wealth, accumulated through controversial financial dealings and money laundering for Nazi interests, provided the means for her attempted rehabilitation. Rather than face the same financial ruin that befell many collaborators, she used her resources to establish the Florence Gould Foundation. This organization, focused on Franco-American cultural exchange, represented a calculated effort to distance herself from her wartime activities. The establishment of literary prizes became a cornerstone of her reputation management strategy. The Critics' Prize, the Roger Nimier Prize for Literature, the Max Jacob Poetry Prize, and awards for engraving and musical composition were all created with clear intent to present herself as a patron of French culture rather than a wartime collaborator. These prizes, while genuine in their support of the arts, served an equally important purpose in her broader campaign of image rehabilitation. Frank J. Gould, who had spent much of the war in the United States, found his own reputation affected by association with Florence's activities. Their marriage, always one of convenience rather than convention, continued to provide mutual benefits even as they lived increasingly separate lives. Florence retained the Gould name, understanding its utility in her efforts to maintain social position despite the shadows cast by wartime investigations. By the 1950s, Florence's strategic philanthropy had achieved some success in shifting public attention from her wartime activities, though it could not erase them entirely. The investigations into her collaboration with Nazi officials and her financial dealings remained part of the public record, even as she worked to build a new identity as a cultural benefactor. Her survival and continued influence spoke less to any rehabilitation of character than to the power of wealth to blur historical memory. The evidence of her wartime choices remained clear and documented, requiring no future discoveries to reveal their extent. The woman who had actively collaborated with occupation forces was not so much transforming herself as attempting to build a parallel narrative through institutional philanthropy. As she approached her later years, Florence understood that while her foundation might influence cultural life for generations to come, it could never fully obscure the reality of her wartime decisions. The coming decades would determine whether her calculated strategy of cultural patronage would succeed in overshadowing her documented collaboration with the Nazi regime. But first, she would need to ensure that her carefully constructed post-war narrative could withstand the weight of historical truth that no amount of philanthropic giving could erase. The Mediterranean sun cast long shadows through the windows of Florence Gould's coastal villa in early 1983. At 87, she maintained the commanding presence that had defined her life, though time had begun to leave its inevitable mark. The woman who had survived wars, scandals, and near prosecution now faced her greatest challenge, the judgment of history itself. Her name graced museum wings, literary prizes, and cultural foundations across France and America. The Florence Gould Foundation, established with funds that investigators had long connected to wartime collaboration, continued to support Franco-American cultural exchange. The same financial records that had nearly led to her prosecution for treason now stood as permanent testament to her activities during the occupation. The art collection she had amassed during the war years, much of it acquired from Jewish collectors forced to sell under duress, represented both her aesthetic taste and her opportunistic nature. Even as pieces made their way into prestigious museums, the circumstances of their acquisition remained an indelible part of their provenance, a fact well documented by post-war investigations. True to form, Florence remained characteristically unapologetic about her past. She had never publicly addressed the accusations of Nazi collaboration, maintaining instead a studied silence about her wartime activities. The evidence, from financial records to witness testimonies, spoke clearly enough without her commentary. On February 28, 1983, Florence Gould died in her Mediterranean villa, leaving behind a legacy as complex as the woman herself. Her will, directing millions to cultural institutions, represented not so much a final attempt at reputation management as the culmination of a long-established pattern of using cultural patronage to maintain social position, despite well-documented controversies. In death, as in life, Florence Gould remained an enigma, a survivor whose determination to endure had led her to documented collaboration with occupying forces. Her story served not as a testament to reinvention, but as evidence that wealth and cultural patronage could often overshadow even the most troubling of wartime activities. The salons she had hosted, the art she had collected under questionable circumstances, and the cultural prizes she had established would ensure her name lived on, even as the historical record continued to clearly document the darker aspects of her narrative. The facts of Florence Gould's life, her collaboration, her art acquisitions from persecuted Jewish collectors, her financial dealings with Nazi officials, remained preserved in investigation records, banking documents, and witness testimonies. She had built an empire during wartime through documented collaboration, transformed that controversial wealth into cultural influence, and ultimately left behind a fortune that would perpetuate both her philanthropy and her notoriety long after her death. In the end, her legacy served as a stark reminder that in times of war, the line between survival and complicity was often crossed not by necessity but by choice. Have you ever wondered how American heiresses marrying European aristocrats shaped history and society? These transatlantic alliances have captured our imaginations from the Gilded Age to the modern era. They are tales of love, affluence, and social standing, but have even greater significance. Today, we'll explore the rise of these fascinating unions, complexities, and enduring impact. We'll uncover the stories of powerful women, political legacies, and the changing dynamics of love and ambition. Let's step into the world of dollar princesses and British aristocrats, where love, wealth, and social status are intertwined. The Gilded Age of the 1870s was a transformative period in American history. It was a time of remarkable economic growth and prosperity following the Civil War's aftermath. The United States embarked on a journey of rebuilding and expansion, with flourishing industries such as railroads, steel, and oil. The accumulation of wealth during this era had a significant impact on reshaping American society. However, like a coin with two sides, the Gilded Age had its hidden complexities. While some individuals amassed immense fortunes through aggressive business practices, they became known as robber barons. The wealth gap between the elite and the rest of society widened, leading to widespread economic disparities. Surprisingly, this era also ushered in new opportunities for women. As the economy expanded, more women entered the workforce, assuming roles in factories, offices, and stores. Some ventured into entrepreneurship, while others pursued professional careers in medicine and law. The Gilded Age was characterized by change and complexity, especially regarding gender roles. As women's incomes increased, their financial impact also grew. They started investing and saving, which significantly changed their financial roles. One notable woman who did this was Hetty Green, the Witch of Wall Street. She made a name for herself as an investor and amassed a fortune of over $100 million, mainly through investments in railroads and businesses. Hetty Green's success demonstrated the changing landscape of women's financial empowerment. During the Gilded Age in 1872, a sophisticated social atmosphere developed. Affluent American families strived for social status by mimicking the European nobility. Their pursuit of this goal involved participating in the social circuit, which consisted of extravagant balls and events that allowed them to display their wealth, prestige, and relationships. During this transformative period, women significantly influenced the social landscape. They didn't just attend grand events, they organized and hosted them while selecting the guest lists. This allowed them to exercise their power and improve their social standing, highlighting their importance in this era. In 1874, Jennie Jerome emerged as an iconic figure of the Gilded Age. A brilliant and affluent American, she moved boldly to London, quickly becoming a prominent figure within the social circuit. Her marriage to Lord Randolph Churchill, a British aristocrat, captured global attention. This historic union not only challenged prevailing gender norms, but also left an indelible mark on history. Jennie Jerome's marriage to Lord Randolph Churchill transcended mere social ascension. It was a trailblazing endeavour characterised by her advocacy for women's rights and her promotion of American interests in the British aristocracy. She navigated her newfound position with grace and intelligence, becoming not just a figure in society, but a catalyst for change in a world still grappling with rigid gender roles. By 1879, American ambitions had shifted. The nation's elite became enamored with European titles to legitimize their wealth and status. Wealthy American women began marrying European aristocrats, while others sought to acquire titles for themselves or their descendants. Pursuing European titles symbolized a desire for acceptance within the European aristocracy, revealing a certain insecurity among the American elite regarding their place in the world. The union of Frances Ellen Work and James Roche, 3rd Baron Fermoy, in 1880, exemplified the typical transatlantic alliance of the Gilded Age. Frances Ellen Work, a wealthy American heiress from the luxurious setting of New York City, married James Roche, who represented the British aristocracy. The union between Frances Work and the Roche family was more than just a simple transaction. It had significant implications for both individuals. Frances Work was financially savvy and used her wealth to help her husband's struggling estate. The Roche family had been burdened with debts for many generations, and Frances Work's fortune was instrumental in saving the estate from financial collapse. Her involvement preserved the family's legacy and demonstrated such union's practical and enduring nature. In 1882, the trend of cash for titles gained popularity. This practice involved American heiresses marrying British aristocrats to help the struggling British nobility overcome financial difficulties due to industrialization and the declining profitability of agriculture. Simultaneously, American women sought ways to enhance their social status and gain acceptance into European aristocratic circles. These unions were inherently mutually beneficial. British aristocrats obtained much-needed financial stability, while American women ascended to coveted titles and elevated social positions. These alliances epitomized the pragmatic exchange of wealth and status, echoing the evolving dynamics of the Gilded Age. The media was pivotal in shaping perceptions of transatlantic alliances during the 1880s. These unions were regarded as significant events emblematic of the growing wealth and influence of the United States. Women like Frances Work understood the power of the press and strategically harnessed its influence to promote their interests. These marriages were newsworthy not only for their financial implications, but also for their social and cultural significance. American heiresses who married into British nobility became fascinating subjects, and the public closely examined their lives and decisions. Frances' work and her contemporaries recognized the allure of this public intrigue and adeptly leveraged the media to advance their agendas. By 1889, transatlantic alliances had ushered in a new era of social mobility for American families. Women who married British aristocrats gained access to the upper echelons of high society. Within these privileged circles, they mingled with other influential individuals, fostering networks that extended their influence far beyond their initial social standing. Furthermore, women skillfully employed their newly acquired titles to promote their personal business interests and philanthropic endeavours. An exemplary case in point was Consuelo Vanderbilt, daughter of William Henry Vanderbilt, one of America's wealthiest men. In 1895, her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough bestowed upon her the title of Duchess of Marlborough, catapulting her into the uppermost echelons of global society. Consuelo Vanderbilt harnessed her social position to advocate for American culture and values, utilizing her immense wealth to support various philanthropic causes, including the arts and education. In 1892, the London social season emerged as a prominent fixture in the lives of the wealthy and elite. Typically spanning from May to July, this period served as an annual gathering for the privileged, featuring a calendar filled with opulent events such as balls, parties and races. The London social season was more than just a series of social gatherings. It was a meticulously orchestrated dance of high society. During the London social season, women played important roles by organising and hosting events, while adhering to strict etiquette and dress codes. They were expected to embody refinement and grace, and their main objective was to find suitable marriages for young women of their social class. The pressure to secure such unions was intense, with families having significant influence. Marriage became a strategic undertaking, where young women navigated societal expectations and personal desires. In 1895, the transatlantic landscape saw a surge in financial rescues due to the increased wealth of America. This helped British aristocrats face financial difficulties from industrialization and the decline in agricultural profits. They found comfort in the form of American heiresses. These women from across the Atlantic sought ways to ascend the echelons of social status and gain acceptance within the European aristocracy. A symbiotic relationship emerged as American heiresses married British aristocrats in exchange for coveted titles and the accompanying social prestige. The financial stability these unions provided was a lifeline for the British nobility, while American women found the social status they so ardently desired. However, by 1897, not all transatlantic alliances had proved successful or harmonious. Some marriages descended into public controversies and ultimately culminated in divorce. In such cases, women often bore the brunt of societal judgment, unfairly shouldering blame for the marital dissolution. A striking illustration of a scandalous divorce was the tumultuous separation of Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough. Consuelo, an American heiress, entered into marriage with the Duke in 1895. Their union was fraught with unhappiness from its inception, ultimately leading to Consuelo's decision to file for divorce in 1906. The divorce proceedings received extensive media coverage, and Consuelo Vanderbilt was in the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Critics questioned her choice and criticised her for ending the marriage. She remained steadfast in her resolve to live life on her terms and refused to conform to expectations set by others. By 1899, the phenomenon of transatlantic alliances had ushered in transformative societal changes on both sides of the Atlantic. These unions were pivotal in dismantling age-old social barriers, promoting greater understanding between American and British cultures, and fostering a sense of shared identity. Moreover, they precipitated shifts in the roles and expectations of women. American women who married British aristocrats often emerged as more independent and outspoken than their British counterparts. They were unafraid to pursue careers and engage in public life, forging new paths for women in society. In 1900, the world bore witness to one of the most highly publicized transatlantic alliances of the 20th century, the marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt to the Duke of Marlborough. This extravagant union joined an American heiress with a British aristocrat in a lavish ceremony that captured the imagination of the media and the public alike. But behind all the glitter and glamour, Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage was far from happy. Despite her fancy title, she was trapped in a troubled relationship right from the start. It got so bad that in 1906, she did something quite bold for her time. She asked for a divorce. What made it even more remarkable was that she openly talked about the mistreatment she had suffered from her husband. It was a courageous move that challenged the norms of her era. In an era when such revelations were considered scandalous, Consuelo Vanderbilt's public statements shattered the silence surrounding domestic violence and the predicaments women trapped in unhappy unions faced. Her courage in shedding light on these issues not only brought attention to her plight, but also paved the way for greater awareness of the challenges faced by women in similar circumstances. By 1905, transatlantic alliances had begun to yield their political legacies. A striking example was Winston Churchill, who had become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during World War II. He was the son of the American heiress Jenny Jerome, and his upbringing and connections on both sides of the Atlantic played a pivotal role in shaping his political career. Women who entered into marriages with British aristocrats also embarked on the journey into political circles. Consuelo Vanderbilt, for instance, used her newfound position to become a vocal advocate for women's suffrage, championing the cause of gender equality. She harnessed her connections to further American interests in the United Kingdom, forging a path for women to participate in politics and actively advocate for their rights. As the calendar turned to 1910, the trend of transatlantic alliances began to wane. The rise of women's suffrage movements, which granted women the freedom to pursue social status and influence outside of marriage, contributed to this shift. Women were no longer as dependent on marriage as the sole means of achieving social standing. Furthermore, nationalism swept the United States and Europe in the early 20th century. People increasingly took pride in their national identities, and the allure of marrying foreigners began to diminish. The world was changing, and the focus shifted from international unions to a renewed sense of national unity and pride. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 had a profound impact on transatlantic alliances. The war altered social priorities as the world grappled with the devastating conflict. During this tumultuous time, the idea of marrying foreigners became less appealing. People were preoccupied with the demands of the war effort, and the prospect of international marriages lost its luster. World War I also marked a transformative period for women. They assumed new societal roles, working in factories, volunteering in hospitals, and even serving in the military. These experiences broadened societal perspectives on women's capabilities, leading to a shift away from viewing them as mere objects to be bought and sold in international marriages. The aftermath of World War I brought about a seismic shift in the economic landscape, reshaping the dynamics of transatlantic alliances. The war had exacted a devastating toll on the European economy, plunging many British aristocrats into dire financial straits. Consequently, American heiresses began to view British aristocrats as less appealing spouses. The once guaranteed financial security and social status they offered were no longer assured, leading to a decline in such unions. Fast forward to the 1950s, and the legacy of the dollar princesses continued to capture the public's imagination. These women, symbolic of the American dream, personified the growing wealth and influence of the United States. They challenged traditional social norms, blazing a trail towards greater gender equality. Their journeys from American wealth to British aristocracy embodied women's evolving societal roles and aspirations. As we moved into the 21st century, the concept of dollar princesses found a place in popular culture. Books, films, and TV series delved into their narratives, shedding light on the complexities of these unions. Notable examples included Edith Wharton's novel The Buccaneers, the 1949 film The Heiress, and the 2000 film The Golden Bowl, all of which explored the lives of American heiresses marrying into British aristocracy. TV series like Downton Abbey and The Crown also featured characters embodying the spirit of dollar princesses, providing insight into their challenges and motivations. While these portrayals in popular culture often cast dollar princesses in a critical light, highlighting materialism and opportunism, they also revealed the nuanced nature of their choices and the societal pressures that shaped their decisions. In the modern era, from 2010 to 2023, we witnessed contemporary examples of dollar princesses marrying relatively less affluent British aristocrats. These unions attracted significant media attention and public scrutiny. Notable instances included Kimberly Guilfoyle, an American attorney and former Fox News personality, marrying Donald Trump Jr., the son of former US President Donald Trump. Meghan Markle, an American actress, entered into marriage with Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, bringing her unique background into the British royal family. Amal Clooney, a British Lebanese barrister and human rights activist, married George Clooney, a prominent American actor and filmmaker. These marriages ignited debates about the motives behind such unions and their societal implications. As of 2023, modern perspectives on transatlantic alliances are multifaceted and intricate. Some perceive them as symbolic of the globalization of the world, fostering cultural exchange and international cooperation. However, others view these unions as cultural imperialism, raising concerns about preserving cultural identities and potential economic consequences for the United States and the United Kingdom. Critics argue that transatlantic alliances may lead to a loss of cultural identity and a drain on financial resources as wealth and assets are transferred across borders. Conversely, proponents contend that such alliances can promote cultural understanding and economic collaboration, enhance international relations, and contribute positively to the broader global landscape. As we end this fascinating journey exploring the complex world of transatlantic alliances, it's evident that these partnerships have had a lasting impact on history, culture, and gender relations. From the Gilded Age to today, American heiresses and British aristocrats have linked their destinies, moulding society in unforeseen ways. But the story doesn't end here. It continues evolving each day. The legacy of these alliances lives on, sparking conversations about love, ambition, and the complex interplay of wealth and status.